active learning pedagogy in a high school classroom at Mount Fort Carson High School. But this story starts a long time ago on Chicago Ridge. If you're not familiar with it, Sam, I know you are, but if you're not familiar with it, Chicago Ridge lies just outside of Leadville. And it's one of the best pieces of Colorado terrain that I know. It's one of my favorite places in the state. In a previous life, I had the opportunity to ski this terrain more often than any human should. And often that's produced a lot of anxiety for me. It wasn't a great experience. Often I ended at the bottom looking like a sugar cookie. But on occasion, the terrain, the weather, and my skill ability just happened to work. It didn't matter what I did. When my skis came into the snow, they glided effortlessly on top of the powder. Every turn was carved into and out of the fall line. My weight was over my ski tips, and I could not do anything wrong. This experience is what Hungarian psychologist Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi would call flow, or an optimal experience. And I first ran across this book several years ago. It was written in 1990, and I used the principles of flow training to train special forces teams for deployment all around the world, to fight in combat in Afghanistan, Iraq, and train our partner nation forces everywhere in the world. What we try to do is match a high level of operator efficiency with a high level of challenge that causes that operator to grow. It causes him to get better in his job, better in his skill. In the classroom, we know we try to do the same thing. We try to fit a high level of skill to an appropriate level of challenge for each student. Vygotsky called this the zone of proximal development. And this is exactly what we're trying to do today. In his own words, Csikszentmihalyi describes flow as a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. You lose track of time. I think we can all say that's happened to us a time or two in our past. You've been so engrossed in an activity that you lose track of time. And that's the experience I'd like to see my kids get in the classroom. There are a few things that everyone needs in order for that to happen. One is a balance between skill and the challenge of the activity. Again, that circles back to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Action and awareness are minimized and distractions are minimized. You'll see if your kids are doing this, that they're not pulling their cell phones out and checking text messages. They're not opening their computers to check their email because they're so engrossed in what you're doing. And again, that sense of time becomes distorted. So imagine my surprise, several years later, like 20 years later, when I'm researching for this topic, that I run across this book, also written by Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. And in Becoming an Adult, Csikszentmihalyi studies high school students as they transition into the workforce. He studies them in and out of school, across multiple subjects, using something called the experience sampling method. He has the students wear a wristwatch, and 8 to 10 times a day, that watch beeps. And when it does, they stop what they're doing, they record the activity, they record how they felt about the activity, and they fill out this long list of questions that gives the researcher the ability to determine if they were engaged. When you look at this book and you look at the long list of activities, what you find is that the social studies, the subject I love to teach, falls absolutely at the bottom of every subject. Even after work. Work after school ranks higher than social studies. And that's because of the way it's traditionally taught, through lecture and rote memorization. So I asked myself, why? This study was in 2000. 17 years later, we're still teaching the same way. Why are we teaching that way? That drove me to 2 research questions. Does an active learning pedagogy increase student engagement? And can I consistently place my students within the zone of proximal development to produce higher levels of engagement? I had 85 students in the study. I collected data over 20 lessons. 8 of those lessons were active in nature, so they were simulation, role-playing, and some collaborative work, a lot of collaborative work actually. 12 lessons were passive, lecture, independent work, some web quests, a lot of reading. I modified the experience sampling method, so I didn't have kids wearing wristwatches. I simply asked them to fill out my experience sampling questionnaire at the end of every class that I was collecting data. Here's my experience sampling questionnaire. I did this again for all 20 of those lessons. I started with 10 questions. And then as I began looking deeper and deeper at the data, I weeded that down to about 5. The 3 questions in red are the questions that I used to answer my first research question. So how were you concentrating? Did you enjoy what you were doing? And was the activity interesting? Those 3 items allowed me to develop a mean engagement scale. So I averaged those across every one of the 20 lessons. and I said, this is what engagement looks like. Then I broke that apart between active and passive lessons, and it gave me an opportunity to compare in the aggregate which one worked better. The last two highlighted in green, we evaluated the challenge of the activity to the student's perceived skill of the activity to determine if I could keep them in the zone of cognitive development. And the data shows that an active learning pedagogy does result in higher levels of student engagement than passive pedagogy. And what this tells me is that kids want to be engaged in the classroom, they want to be social, interact with each other, and they want to collaborate. As you look at the independent lessons, I think the data becomes a little bit more interesting. On this slide, the active lessons are represented in red, and the passive lessons are represented in blue. My highest performing active lesson was a simulation that scored 2.83 on the engagement score. And in this lesson, I really didn't do anything. I set it up, I told the kids what was expected, I gave them some questions, and then they circulated the classroom and they asked each other conversational questions to try to elicit the information that was hidden to answer that question. It was a loud lesson. Mike knows I'm a loud teacher. So I closed the door on this because it was starting to bother people outside. That's how active the kids were in this lesson. Ultimately, they were all able to answer that question, and they were all able to relate back to earlier course content. Two other active learning lessons that weren't as high scoring, but also still pretty well, were conducted a little bit differently. In this case, the kids didn't have to figure out an unknown. They were role-playing or reenacting a part of history. And in doing so, they were doing history, they were learning about what they were doing, but it didn't have that same connection. There was no student autonomy to determine the outcome of that lesson independently. And I think that resulted in a little bit lower score. You look at the passive lessons, and some of them scored really high. Some of them scored equally higher or higher than some of my active lessons. And I think that bears an explanation. The two videos that I scored were very interesting. They were entertaining. They scored very well in the engagement score. The Rape of Nanking is a very, very graphic video, which holds everybody's attention. But these two videos were really not academically significant. My lecture style is a little different than what you may expect. I don't simply talk and expect the students to sit in a box and answer questions or sit in a box and take notes. There's a lot of multiple modality that goes on in the classroom. There's a lot of peripheral talk that I encourage to contribute to the group conversation, and I think that results in a little bit higher level scores for engagement. And then there's these, all the way on your right, truly passive learning lessons. Web quests where they're sitting at a computer workstation looking for information, document analysis, independently reading primary sources and answering questions, and textbook reading. And you can see they scored 1.63, significantly lower than both of the average scores. Something else that's very interesting is in my internship, I used these same principles to put together an active learning lesson for the Pioneers Museum. This was a field trip for middle schoolers to explore the new Story of Us exhibit at the museum. So as these kids come in, they're armed with what they're expected to do. They interact with technology, they're broken into teams, they have questions that they have to answer using conversation, using technology, and using the exhibit themselves. I tested this 2 weeks ago. I used the same instrument with those students to see how it scored. Scored 2.83. The same as my highest scoring simulation in the classroom. And what this tells me is the context that we learn doesn't matter. As long as the principles are in place and there's collaboration and active learning is present, the kids are going to learn. My second research question proved to be the hardest part of the study. Accurately keeping kids within their zone of proximal development. By these scores, looks like I failed. If you see the active learning and passive learning, all these kids believe that their level of skill is way up here, and that my level of challenge is not very good. So I think that may misrepresent a little bit of how things actually went in the classroom. When I look at the individual responses, there are, across the board, kids that think it's challenging and equal to their skills. And some kids think it's middle challenging. Their skills are about moderate. So across 30 independent human beings in every classroom that I taught, how do you do it? It tells me that differentiation's hard, and that I need a little bit more work to make it right. So what's this teach us? Active learning does result in higher levels of student engagement than passive methods of instruction. The best active learning lessons will allow your students some autonomy to determine the outcome. If you're a history teacher, this is going to make you uncomfortable because they're going to rewrite history in your classroom. Be prepared for that. Some passive instruction is going to have to be present in order for active learning to take place. These simulations require background knowledge for them to work. So you're going to have to teach them something passively first. Include collaborative work, break up the reading assignments, and integrate multiple modalities into those assignments. And I'm going to finish back on Chicago Region. I told you at first, my skiing was not the best when I first started skiing Chicago Region. But occasionally, everything works. And when that happens, when I'm in that state, it drives me back to these mountains again and again, trying to find an optimal experience. I saw that in my kids this year. A couple of days after a simulation, they'd come in and ask me, hey, Mr. Pritts, when are we going to do another one of those lessons? That answers my research question. They want to be in the classroom. They want to be engaged. They want to interact with each other, with the content, and with me. They don't want to be kept in a box, obedient, taking notes, and quiet. They want active learning. Thank you.
We have time for some questions, so if anybody would like to ask Mike some questions.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Mike, were any of your simulations from History Alive curriculum?
No, nothing that came, let's see, nothing from History Alive.
Okay.
I did plagiarize some. I didn't
Fair
create them
enough.
all myself.
Fair enough.
Sorry, I
Yeah.
didn't just see it. What age group were you doing it?
Juniors and seniors in high school.
Oh, wow, good job.
What did you find that they responded the most, to be the most challenging of the lessons? If you remember, like one of the specific lessons that did stand apart is, well, most of my students felt challenged at this.
Okay, so there was one particular lesson. I did 3 group projects, and only one of them did I evaluate. The first time I did this group project, I broke apart a rubric called the Thinking Like a Historian rubric. I put teams of 5 together, and that rubric has you analyze a historical question by change over time, continuity, things like that. So each student had a part of the rubric that they had to collectively solve the answer to the historical problem. First one was a complete disaster. They didn't get anything right. So I set it up again a few weeks later, and we did it together as a class. And we still had multiple questions in multiple groups, but I spent a lot of time modeling and a lot of time going around and saying, hey, this is what cause and effect looks like. Or this is an example of change over time with your question. So we did that one as a group. By the time I got to the one, and I think I actually wrote, Mike had me write about that one in the paper, they were very well balanced. A little bit lower on the challenge scale than their skill level, but I think growth from the first time, unevaluatable. The third time, very, very close to flow.
In the design of your experiment, I can't remember if you mentioned this already, but did you control for like the topic and whether or not the topic itself was more engaging or not?
Nope. I threw these in as I could work them into the content through three classrooms full of kids. Each classroom was a little bit different because the dynamic was different. But I didn't control whether or not I thought the topic was exciting or engaging.
Do you think that changed the students' do you think the topic may have influenced the students' engagement score on there? That was a self-assessment that they took, correct? Of their engagement?
Yeah, so a subjective assessment. I think the topic definitely, would influence that. World War I for me is very boring. I read a lot about World War I, but the best way that I can teach about World War I is to take you outside in February, have you dig a hole and stand in it for 6 months. It's just hard to teach because there's not a lot of data on it. World War II, there's so much to talk about. That the kids you would see, some of the lessons during World War II seem to be more engaging. So I think topic has a lot to do with it. I didn't set the study up that way.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.